Yeah, so we're going to dive into a little bit of this Idaho stuff here tonight. Everything has been hot as fuck this week with the grand jury. And yeah, me and Dan have got a lot of actual questions. Today I was going back over the affidavit, some of that stuff. And yeah, just in general, I know that when you were on Jay's show, you were saying, and a lot of different opinions on this, however you want to look at it, but you think that the affidavit is strong.
I do. Well, if you compare PCA in Idaho 4 to say Delphi, can you put those two one next to each other? You can see what an incredibly weak PCA is, which is Delphi.
Right.
And you can see what a strong one is with respect to, the Idaho 4 case. But then on that side pod that I'm talking about, the docket, like I go through, like I have 4 episodes on, Idaho 4. Like one is in the can that's getting produced now that Allison and I just recorded. And it was after the arraignment when he stood silent, which like the whole internet exploded. I'm like, dude, it doesn't mean shit. It's got no legal consequence. It's like the judge entered what he would have said anyway, which is not guilty. And like we were trying to come up with, without being in Ann Taylor's mind. We'll get into that. I'm sure you guys have questions.
That is actually where that was one of them for sure.
Yeah, so like I'll wait on that. But in terms of that PCA, when I start digging into it, then you start to see all the warts. And I'm talking about the Idaho 4. Like the whole thing with Dylan stinks. Like there's something off about that. Like, like this frozen shock phase bullshit doesn't make any fucking sense. This is clearly a kid who's like in college. Everyone rages in college till 4 in the fucking morning. That's not unusual. You have Xana ordering fucking DoorDash at 4:30 in the morning. I mean, that's college. That's what it's like. I mean, like this isn't normal adult world where, we're all in bed by like 1 at the latest. Yep. Some people were in bed by, they raged all night. They went to the bars. They came home at 2:30, fucking around. Like even her seeing somebody walking out of that place, she would have assumed, I think, that somebody in the house hooked up.
That's what I would think. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Because it's like she had no reason to believe, because no one would in that position, that 4 of her roommates had just been murdered. No one is ever fucking thinking that. And she clearly didn't hear any screaming. If she had heard screaming, it would have been in the PCA. So the PCA, like what's silent in the PCA is the shit that tells you what didn't happen.
Right.
Because she had heard people screaming, that 100% would have been in there. If she had heard people screaming, she would have called 911. The fact that she didn't call 911, well, and when you look at it and you're trying to figure out, okay, well, what are the cops trying to accomplish here? And I heard that both Steve and Dan, I heard you guys talking about the concept of cops leading them down the primrose path, which happens all the time. Like exactly what you're saying, where like Dylan is like explaining something, and then the cop suggests, like, well,
yeah.
Well,
they're putting words in her mouth, yeah.
You were in shock. Like you were in shock, right? And she's like, yeah, okay.
Yeah, that
you
works.
know what I mean?
Right, she's probably actually at that moment, she's actually seen some shit, right? She's woke up, seen the house.
At this point, she's traumatized.
At that moment, right? She is in shock.
Yeah.
So, but at 4:30 in the morning, she just thinks her roommates are being assholes and they're like fucking with her ability to be able to fall asleep. She's probably, she hears the dog barking upstairs and she's like, "Shut the fucking dog up!"
Yeah, she's trying to go to bed.
Right, like Xana and Ethan are arguing is what she thinks in her mind. And then she peeks out a few times. She sees some dude leaving. She doesn't see him covered in blood because it's fucking dark. The guy's wearing all black. If he's got a knife, which he had to have because he had to get it out somehow, we know he left the sheath, so it's not in the sheath, so he has to be carrying it by his side, or he tucked it inside of a jacket pocket somewhere. Yeah. But she's not seeing that either. So she has no reason to think anything has gone on nefarious. So she just goes to bed. Like that's why she doesn't call. But Moscow police, they don't call until 11:48 or 58, whatever it is the next day, right before noon. They have to come up with an excuse. Is like, why the fuck wasn't law enforcement called until noon?
Yeah, dude.
When you have 2 surviving people in the house, it makes no sense. So like that was the shit they were trying to deal with, is all this shit was coming down because the whole world was blowing up on this thing. I'm like, man, just, when I started digging into that PCA, it became less strong than at first blush, but like, that's what I do for a living. I read PCAs all the time when they come. My job is to pick them apart, No, because we have no idea. Like, all we know about that DNA on the sheath is claiming it was single source, right? We have no idea what the quality of the DNA, like, we don't know if they're going to get a partial profile or a full profile. We don't know any of that. And anybody who's acting like they do know is full of shit, because we don't know. I deal with DNA in my cases, and I know what a good profile looks like, and I know what a shit profile looks like. And if it's like a partial profile, it's not going to be that great of evidence in terms of, look, like, this is a bulletproof. The guy has his fucking DNA on this sheath. Now explain why it's in here.
Well, actually, I have a question. I have a question about that. So, could they determine, after analyzing the father's DNA, could they determine 99.999% on a partial sample from the sheath?
I mean, maybe. Like, as to dad, but like, dad's irrelevant now. Like, the internet was blowing up, and people were like messaging me and like, oh, is the sheath gonna be? Because, like, if you look at one of their state's responses for the discovery, like the motion to compel from the defense, where they're saying turn shit over, you owe us shit. We know this shit exists and we want it. And one of the things they've been asking for is the genealogical DNA like tests. They just want to see all the data. They want to see the research that was done, so that they have it. And I think that they have a right. I think ultimately the judge is going to rule that they have to turn it over, because the state is like, look, it's like, number one, we're not using that DNA because we now have the defendant's DNA. That's what we'll use. That'll be the profile that we're comparing. Dad's is never coming into trial. We have no intent on using that. So people were confusing that as saying that, oh, well, now they're not going to introduce the sheath. I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? It's the strongest piece of evidence they have. Of course they're introducing the sheath. Now, if they're like, the sheath is one thing, because the sheath was found pursuant to a search, whether it was warrantless at first, which is, there's a carved out exception for it, because there was a homicide that took place. So the cops, when they walk in a homicide scene, there's an exception to the warrant where they can search the house. Number one, they're going to clear the house. Number two, then they're going to conduct a search. But then they're going to send somebody over to the courthouse to go get the warrant, which they did. So they covered their ass every way that they could with that. So the sheath is getting in. The question is whether or not they're going to turn over those reports. And if they continue to refuse to do it, the judge might bar them from putting any DNA evidence in, which will force them to cave, give the defense whatever the fuck they want with it, because the defense deserves to have it all, so that they can send it to their expert so they can compare. Because there is a chain of custody issue, at least as to the DNA that came from dad. Like, the sheath never went anywhere other than Idaho,
The third party
police, and then sending it to the lab, and then it gets sent back to Idaho. Like, the garbage from, the house in PA, that went from PA to a lab to Idaho, or from PA to Idaho to a lab. You know what I'm saying? And like, anytime you have evidence and anytime it starts moving into different hands, that's where you worry about the chain of custody. For us, for defense attorneys, chain of custody is everything. That's how I know that they're not fucking tampering with the evidence.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, that's huge for us, because that concept that, the police never cheat is, of course, ridiculous. I mean, they do. I mean, like, the cops aren't out there trying to like plant shit on innocent people. What they do is they plant shit on people that they think did it, and they don't have the evidence to get them. Like, that's what happens.
That's
it's like,
scary as fuck.
It's scary as fuck, right? So
before we move on, I got a legal question, Bob, about the father's DNA comparison thing. So because that was actually used in the probable cause affidavit, would that then be required to be handed over to the defense because it was in the PCA?
That's what the defense is saying. And then when the state replied in their response, which I've obviously read at this point ad nauseum, the state is saying, look, pursuant to 16.1 of the IRC, which is the Idaho Rules of Criminal Law, that they don't have to turn it over because that DNA did not belong to the defendant. It's not relevant to the case. We're not using it. So when we have that hearing on the 9th of June, Dan, it's going to be all about that. Like, that is what that battle is going to be about, whether or not they have to turn it over. But what I'm telling you, it really is irrelevant in terms of the case, because they have DNA of the defendant. You know what I'm saying? Like, the old man's DNA is irrelevant. What they're going to have is a profile that they've created from the defendant's DNA because he was compelled to give it over. So they went and created the DNA from that. And then they have the profile that they've got from the sheath. So you got the sheath and then you've got his. And that's what the comparison is. The old man shit is irrelevant. It really is. It doesn't matter at all. But point is, the defense deserves to be able to see that report that was generated off that DNA that was found there, just to see how they got to it. You know what I'm saying? Like for comparison's sake, they're going to want to be able to turn that over to their expert to look at it. Like,
does it feel like there is some shady shit going on to you from looking at it? Like,
no, I mean, dude, it's
is it just kind of how the game's played? Like,
I know how the game's played, dude. Like if you ever get to my Garcia season, that was a fucking war. That was a fucking war. I mean, Allison got kicked off that case for doing a Skype interview with the news because they hated my wife because she's a fucking pit bull. She was literally papering them to death with her motion work was unbelievable. She was fucking they were like, dude, we got to get rid of this bitch because she is a fucking animal. Like for real though. And it was and that was a war. They did, it's like a case like that. The state has spent so much money, so much manpower, so much time, and they have so much invested in this guy being the guy. They're going to do everything in their power to get that conviction. And, and if you've got a strong defense attorney on the other side, you're going to fight like hell.